Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for coming and attending our ASAPA webinars. I will have Dr. Bakri Abdelmajid moderating this session. Thank you, Bakri, for the arrangement and for moderating. Please take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Muntasir. And thank you all for attending our first of the year webinar. And I am really glad to introduce Nasreen Al-Lamin. Nasreen gives us the best of the Ivy League education. She has a bachelor in socio-political development from Harvard University, and she did her PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University, and she worked as a postdoc with the Society of Fellows at Columbia University. Nasreen is now a professor of international studies at Bryn Mawr College. In addition to her academic work, Nasreen is an activist and advocate. She has been working with groups of people fighting for their land in a number of countries, in Chile, in Brazil, in Tanzania. She has been an advocate, an educator, organizer in the U.S., and she has grants from the National Science Foundation. She has been very active publishing her research. So we are really glad to have you, Nasreen, and I will turn the podium to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bakri and Dr. Muntasir, for this opportunity and this invitation. I should preface this by saying that I haven't prepared a very formal talk. I kind of put together some thoughts on land rights that I thought would be the most relevant, kind of drawing from my research. So it might not appear as coherent as I'd like it to be, but hopefully there'll be something of use to you. Also, I have a 2-year-old who was supposed to go down for her nap, but has not yet. So you might see her coming in and out and protesting, asking me what I'm doing. So I apologize in advance for that. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Is that possible for me to do? I think the host has to enable that. I don't know. Let me see. Ah, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Sorry. All right. Can everybody see the screen? Is it okay? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. It's visible.
Okay.
We
great.
can see it.
Okay. So I'm going to start. So Sudan's December revolution gained momentum and mass participation thanks to the convergence of decades-old grievances against state violence and marginalization in peripheral areas, with rural demands for land reform and urban calls for justice and economic security. At the center of these demands and grievances is land, the right to live on and off it, the right to return to it, and the right to benefit from the resources that lie above and beneath it. Initially, Sudan's constitutional charter during this transitional period, drafted by members of the new transitional government, said very little about land rights or land reform. In fact, the word land itself appears only twice under essential issues for peace negotiations in a line that reads, quote, issues of land and tribal lands. The Juba Peace Agreement deals more comprehensively with the issue of land, but it is, as well as you all know, very fragile and incomplete peace agreement, which has no financial backing as such to support the implementation of those proposals, and is of course now in great jeopardy post the military coup that took place on October 25th. If we have time at the end of this talk, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the Juba Peace Agreement and its provisions or proposals around land. I had originally set out to give a talk that draws on my fieldwork in rural communities carried out over a period of 7 years to explore how smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and agricultural workers in Central Sudan articulate what land justice might look like during this transitional period and beyond. Instead, what I'd like to do today is to draw on this research to respond to a report released by members of the former transitional government and funded by the UNDP in May of last year, and to kind of respond a little bit to what is included in this in terms of proposals. The report I'm referring to, this is the cover, is an excellent report that synthesizes and draws on the expertise of many Sudanese experts and researchers. The report aims to support the transitional government in identifying urgent needs and priorities. It considers the issue of land rights, and land reform in substantial and thorough ways, and rightly identifies the need to overhaul and restructure the current legal framework that legalizes and institutionalizes state land seizures and other forms of dispossession and enclosure. It also highlights the need to protect the rights and customary laws of local communities with a particular attention to historical and traditional rights to land ownership, tenure, and use. It aims to mitigate and reverse the environmental damage that has accompanied large-scale mechanized farming practices. Overall, it represents a comprehensive effort to center land as an urgent priority during the transitional period. There is a tension, however, in the strategy outlined in the report between this effort to address long-standing landed inequalities and environmental challenges and an over-reliance on private investment as a kind of panacea for rendering Sudan's agricultural sector more productive. And so this is the minor point that I wish to address. My research focuses on Gulf, mainly Saudi and Emirati investments in Sudanese land, and the impact these large-scale land deals have had on different communities in Central Sudan. I look specifically at the ways people are negotiating and organizing against state-driven land seizures, and on how these changes in land ownership are reconfiguring the relationship between landless and landholding communities, which include landless farm workers, pastoralists, seasonal harvesters, dispossessed smallholder farmers, local landowners, and investors. The forms of resistance I study are shaped by people's specific relationship to land and to the state. They have ranged from civil disobedience and sabotage tactics, like burning down the water pumps and destroying the irrigation canals of foreign-owned agribusiness farms, to legal advocacy, making claims to land the government has deemed unproductive and untitled, despite the fact that pastoralists and farmers have been using it for generations, both in and outside the formal court system, often driven by the work of independent sort of farmers' unions or organizing bodies. 2, social spatial forms of resistance, like seed banking, destroying fence enclosures to regain access to traditional grazing routes, growing subsistence food at the edges of commercial farms, to worker organizing through sanadig and strikes, etc. I should mention as a kind of side note that I also study domestic investors and the effects of the commercialization of the agricultural sector more broadly. One farm I look at, for instance, in my dissertation, is one that was leased by Osama Dawood, or the Dal conglomerate, and is situated just outside of Khartoum. It's called Al-Waha, or Oasis, and you can see it here. This is in the square right here. Yeah. Okay. Sudan leased it from the Bashir regime, who in turn seized it from a group of 800 small investors from around the country and the diaspora, who had invested in a Sudanese Kuwaiti mechanized farming scheme in the late 80s and 90s on land that previously belonged to local villagers, pastoralists, and smallholder farmers. And this is a perfect example of how historically layered processes of land dispossession tend to be. If we were to look at medium and large domestic investors as a group, a significant number of them would be affiliated with the military. The military has invested pension funds, for instance, in lands deemed unproductive and unused under the 1970 Unregistered Land Act, and has seized lands that farmers and pastoralists have been using for generations for rain-fed farming and herding. This seizure of land forms part of the larger story of Sudan's ongoing militarization of rural areas, not only in the peripheral areas and borderlands, but also closer to the center as well. And we see this militarization not only through military elites seizing lands, and maybe militarization is not the right word, but for lack of a better term. So we see it through the seizing of lands as assets for commercial purposes by military elites, but also in the ways that the Emirati-owned farm that I study, for instance, has developed a strong relationship with security forces who arrest and imprison pastoralists for grazing their animals. For grazing their animals within the enclosure of their farms. So some herders will break in sort of through holes in the fence of this Emirati-owned farm. They'll then call the security forces, who will arrest the pastoralists, seize their animals in the process, and then release them one by one based on a fee per animal. So it's also kind of a way for them to make money. So I'll draw on some of this research to question this assumption that private investments in large-scale agricultural projects are the most effective way to develop Sudan's agricultural sector. A couple of points I want to make before giving you some of the latest data.
Nasreen, excuse
Yes?
me. The PowerPoint is kind of stagnant. Is that how you intend it to be, or are you?
Sorry, no. Yes, let me move it forward. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
A couple of points I want to make before giving you some of the latest data on large-scale land deals in Sudan. The history of land enclosures and land dispossession in Sudan is incredibly is violent and layered, and access to Sudanese land has always been racialized, classed, and gendered. As much as people speak of a recent land rush in Sudan and Africa more broadly, and here you can see a kind of representation of this land rush, right? It's not new, nor can we separate it from this violent colonial and post-colonial history of dispossession. But as you can see on this map here, Sudan kind of lies at the center of the more recent land rush. Another point is that the legal framework that paved the way for this current wave of land dispossessions was created under British colonial rule with the aim of bringing communal lands under state control for the extraction of cotton and other cash crops to fuel its industrial revolution. After independence, elements of these colonial land laws were adopted almost verbatim into the Unregistered Land Act passed under Nimeri in 1970, which, quote, transfers in full to the government ownership of land, whether waste, forest, communally owned, occupied, or unoccupied, which was not been registered prior to 1970. With subsequent revisions in 1984 and then under the Bashir regime, under the Bashir regime to attract foreign investors. As the law currently stands, domestic and foreign investors who establish agribusiness farms on Sudanese land bear virtually no responsibility in relation to the communities who are dispossessed in the process in terms of compensation, jobs, infrastructure, and development. From the investor point of view, Sudan under the former regime was one of the easiest places to obtain cheap land with no strings attached, which is why you saw Emirati and Saudi investments in Sudan reach $16 and $13 billion respectively in the post-secession period, so from 2011 onwards, with most of this money going into real estate and land. In the 1970s, this legal framework was used by the Nimeri regime to violently dispossess and displace communities in Sudan's peripheral regions, like South Sudan, Kordofan, Blue Nile, etc., in order to suppress dissent and facilitate the exploitation of their natural resources. As Nimeri was trying to resolve the country's deepening debt crisis at the time, this gave rise to a vision of transforming Sudan into the breadbasket of the Middle East, through the expansion of mechanized farming financed by Gulf investors. At the time, these Gulf countries were dealing with the twin oil crises of the 70s, which gave them an incentive to invest. While most of these Gulf finance projects ultimately failed for a variety of reasons, they succeeded in creating the infrastructure, legal framework, institutions, and relationships that paved the way for this current wave of Gulf investments in Sudanese land under the former regime. I bring up Nimeri and the pro-NCP era because land justice in Sudan hinges on the dismantling of this legal framework and of the post-colonial order, which allowed both Nimeri and al-Bashir to stay in power for so long and to violently suppress dissent and dispossess people of their land and resources, particularly in marginalized areas. Now, it's difficult to verify and access data on large-scale land deals in Sudan that involve foreign investors. But about 32 such land deals have been signed over the last decade for periods ranging from 20 to 99-year leases. 18 of these 32 deals are now in operation. To date, these deals have brought an estimated 5 million acres of Sudanese land under the control of domestic and foreign agribusiness investors. Of these investors, which include Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, Lebanon, Turkey, and Syria, Saudi and Emirati companies have signed the largest number of leases. Having secured over 15 deals for over 1 million acres of land, these Saudi and Emirati companies now own more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined. According to a 2010 World Bank study, Sudan has awarded the highest number of land tenure contracts to foreign investors. A 2011 study concluded that approximately 21 out of 102, or 19%, cases of land confiscation in Africa and Asia occurred in Sudan, the highest rate across the two continents. Now, as staggering as these numbers are, I was surprised actually to find out that while most of this land is cordoned off with securitized fences, it is often not being used or only partially farmed. So I'm going to show you here, these are two of the farms that I study. The top one is Al-Waha farm owned by Osama Dawood and the Dal conglomerate. And the bottom one is this Al-Waha one owned by, it's called the Zayed Al-Khair farm, and it's owned by Al-Anhar group, which is an Emirati group. And this one in particular, you'll see here, this is the only part of the farm that's actually being farmed, the green part. So I think out of about, I want to say 42,000 hectares, only about 6,000 are being used. So this begs the question then, if this is not simply about Gulf Arab food security, then what else is this about? A partial answer to this question is that many of these farms are acting as placeholders for future uncertainties, but also as a way of funneling money into the pockets of the former regime in order to, or the current, I guess, coup leaders, right, in order to further Saudi and Emirati geopolitical interests, like getting Sudan, for example, in the past to send thousands of troops to fight in the war on Yemen on their behalf. In return, the UAE and Saudi Arabia lobbied on Sudan's behalf to get the US government to partially lift Clinton-era sanctions and to get Sudan off the Muslim ban list, etc., even as the relationship between the two kingdoms is shifting. Similarly, for Egypt, this is about water and about losing arable land once Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam is completed. In other words, land and investments in land was doing a whole lot of work for the former regime and its foreign allies beyond food security and beyond developing Sudan's agricultural sector. These investments are, of course, nothing new, as I mentioned. The Gulf has long invested in Sudan's agricultural sector. But rather my point is that these investments continue to serve particular kinds of economic and political interests that benefit both Sudanese and Gulf Arab elites. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues here. The majority of these agribusiness farms produce wheat, cotton, peanuts, biofuels, and a variety of crops for animal consumption on dairy farms such as alfalfa. So they're not actually producing much sort of food for human consumption. Much of this land has been cordoned off by big fences and security guards that cut off access to it for pastoralists and farmers, but in many cases, only a small portion of the farm is actually in operation, as you can see here. So this farm, as I mentioned, it's over 40,000 acres of land. Only 6,000 of it is used to produce a Dominican alfalfa crop, which is used for animal feed. And much of it is then shipped out to dairy farms in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So companies like Al-Marai, et cetera, that produce dairy. This type of farming is also heavily mechanized, which means a handful of technicians and overseers, most of whom are foreign, Syrian, Egyptian, Yemeni, Indian, and Filipino, can run their day-to-day operations. So there's not actually a lot of Sudanese workers who work on this farm, except during the harvesting season. And that's when they hire a couple of hundred, mostly women, to clear the fields after the tractors. And, so it's very kind of labor-intensive work that is underpaid. The report highlights the fact that large areas of land have, quote, been distributed to foreign investors without any directives or assessments, resulting in forests and natural resources being damaged or misused. It also links land degradation and soil erosion to the misuse of fertilizers, overgrazing, and monoculture farming. So my research confirms this. A Saudi-owned company, for instance, aggressively pumped water from the aquifer under their 200,000 acre farm in White Nile State, such that wells serving nearby communities have run dry. On this Emirati farm, the cultivation of water-intensive alfalfa and the unchecked use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides have depleted and contaminated both soil and water resources. During a focus group discussion I led with 7 pastoralist men who live on the edge of a village bordering the Zaid al-Khair farm in 2016, they drew a link between this agricultural pollution and the health of their animals. After years of conflicts with the farm's management, which at the time was foreign, they've switched it to Sudanese management, and local police over access to the land the farm sits on, several of the men had recently negotiated limited access to already harvested land within the farm's boundaries for grazing. One of them, Ibrahim, an agro-pastoralist in his late 50s, insists that several of his cows have gotten sick after consuming alfalfa that had been sprayed with pesticides, impacting their milk production and overall health. Others suspected that the farm's irrigation canals is polluted from an overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, and linked this to an increase in a particular illness that gives animals a kind of fever or shakes that they had never seen before. I also spent a significant time during my research harvesting on different farms alongside landless women agricultural workers who alternated between working. And so this is what some of these farms look like, right? The commercial farms. This is how the alfalfa is kind of packaged to be shipped abroad. And here we are, this is on a farm that is adjacent to the Zaid al-Khair farm, harvesting, I believe this is either bamia or aswad, I'm not sure exactly. I believe this is aswad. Eggplants, yes. So I spent a significant time with landless women agricultural workers who alternated between working on the Zaid al-Khair farm and on these nearby medium-sized agribusiness farms owned by Sudanese domestic investors. So basically the establishment of foreign agribusiness farms has kind of led to the mushrooming of these more medium-sized Sudanese-owned farms, as indebted smallholder farmers are unable to compete and sell their land to the highest local bidder. In other words, we've seen a kind of gradual consolidation of land in the hands of local elites over the past 2 decades, who on the one hand have benefited from the lack of regulation surrounding the overuse of harmful pesticides and fertilizers. On the other hand, many of the farms' owners complain that they've had to use them in order to compete with foreign-owned farms whose overuse of insecticides have led to pests being flushed out of their fields into those of their neighbors. A parallel trend has seen pastoralist women who used to herd, milk goats, and prepare samin, which is a type of ghee or clarified butter, for sale to local merchants and households, lose a vital source of income because of the availability of packaged samin and milk in village stores by Sudanese companies like Dal, but also by Saudi companies like Al-Marai. Many pastoralist women have since turned to agricultural labor on agribusiness farms, medium and large, to make ends meet, like we see here. Much of this harvesting labor is also done by war-displaced women and women of Fulani descent who have recently become more organized through associations. Over the course of my fieldwork, I learned anecdotally, and this is quite concerning, of cases of cancers, birth defects, and asthma since these farms they work on began importing pesticides from China and India. And I just want to kind of show you here a little bit. So here we're harvesting bamia, and you see the residue here. This is from some of the pesticides that are being used. And here's an image of the kind of toxic elements used to farm both okra and tomatoes on one of the farms I harvested on. This is an insecticide called malathion. For those of you who go back and forth to Sudan, I would say, you know, wash your tomatoes in particular very, very well. In the privacy of people's homes, suspicions were traded, linking a person's illness or death to their exposure to pesticides through farm work. Here's actually a seed that is treated with thyrum poison. I'm not a scientist, so most of the data that I'm showing you here is anecdotal and sort of based on the interviews with local doctors as well. Interviews with local doctors confirm my suspicion that these cases are disproportionately affecting landless women harvesters and their young male overseers. Some women harvesters drew the connection between infertility and exposure to petrochemical fertilizers as well. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that the distribution of land to foreign investors without any directives or assessments has resulted not only in the depletion, damage, and contamination of natural resources, as the report points out, but that this contamination and toxicity is in turn putting the health and well-being of people and animals at risks. While the data I've cited, as I mentioned, is anecdotal, it demonstrates that the experiential knowledge of the pastoralist communities surrounding large agribusiness farms and of women harvesters has the potential to guide future scientific studies on the impact of the use of petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides on the environment and on the health of people and animals that interact with it. By contrast, there is much less evidence, because this is something that is brought up a lot by mostly UN reports that I've seen, and World Bank reports as well, on sort of arguing for the commercialization of agriculture. There's much less evidence that pastoralist overgrazing is driving desertification and land degradation. The report concludes that a kind of tandem strategy is needed to regulate investments and to hold investors accountable to a set of environmental and social guidelines, while also creating more incentives to attract foreign investments in oil, agriculture, and the mining sector. Yeah. Let me go back to, so this is just an image of somebody who's spraying. So you have both the harvesters, but also these young men who are spraying the pesticides and fertilizers before they harvest. A major challenge identified is the need to keep investors from fleeing elsewhere to more economically and politically stable pastures. And I would like to suggest that there is perhaps an alternative approach to this, best articulated by some of the people that I worked with during my fieldwork. Before I highlight their perspectives, and sort of their perspectives not only on kind of the commercialization of agriculture, but also more broadly about land justice, I'd like to challenge the assumption that mechanized and commercial farms are more efficient and productive than small farmers, drawing on a very recent report published by the London School of Economics and on some of the data gathered by Eddie Thomas in particular. So this is the report. In it, they take the example of sesame farming. Sudan is one of the world's top producers of sesame, but it's also one of the least efficient producers. Yields are around 0.2 or 0.3 metric tons per hectare in comparison to Tanzanian and Nigerian farms, who produce about 3 times as much per hectare. Half of Sudan's sesame is produced by small farmers in what is called the traditional sector, who in Darfur, for instance, produce about 0.4 metric tons per hectare. By contrast, semi-mechanized and commercial farms in Eastern Sudan produce about half as much per hectare. Small farms who own the land they farm on are simply better at weeding their plots and at sort of dealing with flooding and the impact that that has on their yields. And this is mostly through seed diversity. So they generally use a kind of more diverse seeds and don't use as much kind of GMO or hybrid seeds. They use organic pesticides and fertilizers mostly that don't destroy the soil, they allow fields to lay fallow. And so generally they're using kind of more sustainable farming practices. Most of the large agribusiness farms I study don't grow food crops, at least not for people. So it's a little bit harder to kind of compare the two. They grow, as I said, mostly crops for meat and dairy production. But what is clear is that their farming methods are too aggressive for yields to sustain themselves at the same level over a long period of time. So we've seen over the last, I would say, decade or two, the few farms, even the farm that I study, they're now looking for land elsewhere because they've almost depleted the soil and even the water sources, right? Rather than providing my own recommendation, I'm going to now move, I'm going to end soon, to kind of highlight some recommendations of several people who articulate a clear and concrete vision that kind of challenges this idea that large-scale private investments in agriculture is the best way forward to revive Sudan's agricultural sector. And I'm going to start with Ahmed, and it's obviously a pseudonym. He's a member of the Gezira Farmers Alliance that formed part of the Forces of Freedom and Change. I interviewed Ahmed several times between 2013 and 2018 as I followed the Alliance's activities. He's a farmer on the Gezira scheme himself. He insists that members of their alliance are not against investment per se, but against the kinds of investments that are undermining people's livelihoods and benefiting foreign investments and the handful of government elites they partner with. Quote, "These kinds of farms grow crops for export and rarely employ local people," he explains. Instead, he suggests a model of investment that encourages and incentivizes investors to partner with local farmers. He imagines groups of farmers forming cooperatives that can attract investments from abroad in return for a share of their produce. This idea of forming farmers' cooperatives that could attract investors was echoed by several farmers I met with during my fieldwork. It raises questions around the kinds of legal reforms that would need to be put in place to protect farmers and hold investors accountable, to guidelines that would ensure maximum benefits for local communities and the national economy more broadly. But it does seem to be quite a viable proposal. Sudanese legal scholar Abdullahi Ali Ibrahim argues that Sudanese elites often replicated the legal despotism, hierarchies, and methods of their former colonizers in an attempt to decolonize the legal system in the post-colonial period. Mark Massoud argues further that the NCP regime, which had little social support in the beginning, helped secure its longevity through legal politics, specifically its uses of law and legal institutions as political resources. He writes, having learned from his predecessors, he turned the law into a servant of his political agenda to an extent unmatched by any of Sudan's previous governors. Here talking about, I think, the governor of the Gezira. Both Masood and Ibrahim point to a complex history and legal system which has been used by the former regime to exert its control over Sudan's most marginalized communities and their resources. Dismantling and rebuilding the system is a complicated endeavor, precisely because it has not been done before. What is clear is that it will require the input and expertise of those most negatively impacted by it, including farmers like Ahmed and representatives of the 2.5 million landless workers on the scheme who are at risk of being sidelined in the creation of the kinds of cooperatives he's proposing. My research explores the dangers that arises when the law is used to promote redistributive land justice, which leads me to suggest that legal reforms around access to land and land ownership must be informed by and embedded in extra legal local conflict resolution and distributive justice processes that bring all impacted parties to the negotiation table. Next, I'm going to go to somebody named Roda, who's a landless harvester in the Eastern Blue Nile region, who belongs to a pastoralist group. Roda hopes to one day create a different kind of cooperative on a much smaller scale than the ones Ahmed envisions. In a conversation over tea, she explained to me that this cooperative would operate based on a kind of sandoog, where landless workers would pool their money to purchase a plot or farm that they would then run as a collective. People would be assigned different roles, which had allowed them to distribute and sell their produce in local markets. They would hire people to package and transport goods, provide water and clean irrigation canals as needed. They would bank and barter seeds from previous harvests, and membership in the collective would be based on whether or not a harvester could commit to monetary membership and time requirements that are decided on by its participants. Roda acknowledges that forming such a cooperative in times of economic crisis would be near impossible, but is hopeful that it could one day become a reality. Roda's goal of forming a workers-owned cooperative was perhaps one of the most concrete, creative articulations I heard of what land justice might look like. Historically, there are a few examples of similar kinds of cooperatives in Sudan and many beyond its borders as well. What is particularly significant about the cooperative Roda envisions is that it would be led and owned and run by women at a time when the vast majority of farms in the region are owned and led by men, even though the labor is mostly female. Given that 60 to 70% of Sudanese households rely either fully or partially on agriculture to make a living, this could be quite significant in sparking a wider trend of women-owned farms across the region. Like Ahmed's conception of cooperatives, however, it raises larger questions around the kinds of economic reforms and state agricultural extension services that would have to be put in place to allow marginalized landless women harvesters to accumulate enough wealth to purchase land and run a cooperative farm. Sudanese feminist scholars have long argued that women and marginalized women in particular are often excluded from crucial decision-making spaces, despite the fact that they have always been at the forefront of revolutions and movements that have overthrown regimes. Nada Ali, for instance, argues that centering women's discourses of resistance allows us to interrogate the ways intersections of gender, race, and other aspects of identity shape women's and men's experiences of oppression and resistance. She calls for the need to think about issues of gender broadly as they shape the ways our economy and political system is structured. Within this context, Roda's conception of a worker-owned cooperative speaks to the ways the Sudanese economy has marginalized people across the country based not only on gender, but on race, enslaved descent, and ethnicity as well, many of whom, like Roda, form the backbone of the country's agricultural economy. Last year, there were important developments in Sudan leading to the dismantling, I guess this is actually 2 years ago now, of the former ruling party and the abolition of a set of discriminatory public order laws. These laws criminalized women wearing trousers, leaving their hair uncovered, etc., and were often used by security officers to harass and arrest women journalists, musicians, and dissidents who criticized the regime. What is perhaps less discussed is that they were also used to systematically target and undermine the livelihoods of working class women tea and alcohol vendors as well. While this is a big victory for the feminist movement in Sudan, The next step, as many have pointed out, is to begin thinking about gender issues more broadly in relation to the ways working class women have been marginalized and excluded from the national economy. Supporting women's-led worker and farmer cooperatives like the one Roda has proposed would be one example of taking such an integrative approach. And finally, Fatna. Fatna is a seasonal landless harvester. She's a young woman I met while harvesting on a medium-sized Sudanese-owned okra farm bordering the Emirati Zaid al-Khair farm. Fatna's family is originally from the Nuba Mountains, but settled in the Khartoum area, and then eventually in the Gezira, fleeing state violence in their home. Fatna has a bachelor degree in agricultural science from, I believe, the University of the Gezira, but despite many attempts, has been unable to find a job with a livable wage upon graduation without the necessary connections or wasta needed to find a job in sort of civil service, for example. She harvests to supplement her family's income. In many conversations with Fatna, I was particularly struck by her hopes for the future. She tells me that she wants to return home after the war in the Nuba Mountain ends to start a farm there where they only use organic materials to grow food. The connection she draws here between peace in the Nuba Mountains and other parts of the country and the creation of organic, sustainable farms that grow food is significant. It articulates a vision of peace that necessarily includes food sovereignty and sustainable farming practices that protect both workers and consumers. Like Roda, Fatna points to these issues that are integral to maintaining a sustainable peace and to addressing the impact of agricultural production and our current climate crisis in Sudan and beyond, but are often an afterthought. Critical among them is the right of war-displaced people to return to their homelands and food sovereignty. Another is the right of workers to work and live in safe environments without risking exposure to harmful toxins and chemicals. In recent months, mining workers and communities, I should say years now, in South Kordofan and Sennar have protested the use of toxins such as mercury and cyanide by gold and uranium mining companies in their areas. These toxins have seeped into underground water reservoirs, killing both animals and a handful of people. In August of 2019, the Demanded Bodies Association reported that 1,500 fetal and neonatal deformities were caused by mining companies that use toxic chemicals. In response to these protests, the Sudan Council of Ministers has called on mining operations to immediately halt the use of toxic mercury and cyanide. A similar ban on the use of harmful pesticides should be implemented as well. But what Fatna's hopes suggest is the need for Sudan to move beyond such bans towards supporting sustainable agricultural practices. This resonates with the analysis of many pastoralists I worked with as well. They warn that extractive and toxic industrial farming practices are depleting, in this case, the Gezira's soil and water resources at a pace that will soon have a devastating impact on local communities and animal herds in the area. Given that sheep, goats, wheat, sugar, sesame, and gum arabic are currently among Sudan's top exports, this will have a negative impact on the country's economy as well. While suggesting what such policies might look like is beyond the scope of this talk, it is clear that pastoralists and landless workers whose health and livelihoods are most impacted by agricultural pollution, should be at the table as such policies are crafted. For many whose livelihoods are tied to land, the December Revolution did not come as a surprise and was instead seen as a response to the grievances and injustices they have been organizing around for years. In the Gezira, for example, about 60% of the agricultural labor is carried out by landless workers, many of whom are Fulani or of Western Sudanese descent. They constitute almost 40% of the population. In 2018, an association known as the Kanabi Congress formed to represent the approximately 2.5 million people who work as planters and harvesters and live in worker communities across the region. The Congress was established after a series of home demolitions and targeted attacks were carried out by the military regime on several of these worker communities in the aftermath of a land dispute. Originally formed to demand better housing and living conditions, and I'm almost done, the Congress and the communities it represents have increasingly become politicized. An active member of the Kanabi Congress explained to me during a phone conversation in late 2018 that land justice is not simply about better living and working conditions for agricultural workers, but about challenging generational landlessness and a system of land ownership and land use that has long marginalized their communities. Ultimately, he insisted, it is about giving workers rights to the land they have worked on for generations. In other words, it is about challenging the way land ownership and access to land is defined and protected by the law. Another example is the case of Umdom, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Khartoum, where a 2013 deal between the Sudanese government, elites, and a Saudi billionaire over communal land that local people had been using for generations was successfully reversed through coordinated civil disobedience. In the aftermath of the reverse deal, however, a community of settled pastoralists were excluded from the land redistribution process because they could not trace their ancestry back to Umdom's founding fathers. The deal Umdom activists had negotiated with government elites relied on notions of land ownership tied to ancestry, inheritance, and burial practices that are not only class, but also gendered and racialized. This particular notion of land ownership as tied to ancestry necessarily marginalizes pastoralists and other mobile communities, such as seasonal agriculture workers. This conception of property is in turn protected by land laws that were created by the British colonial government to facilitate ongoing processes of dispossession, of accumulation by dispossession. And so I'm going to end here because of time, but say that undoing and reversing large-scale land deals is a complex endeavor that will require a reconceptualization of the ways property is defined and codified in law. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Nasreen, for such a comprehensive presentation of what is happening with land in Sudan. I will open the floor for questions, please post your questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat. Let me start with the first question on the Q&A. Any idea about whether or not land grab continued after the revolution, and if so, by whom? So basically, after 2019,
yeah,
did we see any expansion of the land grab?
That's a great question. I've been trying to figure that out. There isn't much transparent data on it, and I haven't, as I've said before, been able to go back since to kind of verify. But what I do know is that there've been in that sort of period right before right before in the period where the Transitional Military Council was kind of in charge, the Saudis and Emiratis pledged quite a bit of money to kind of prop them up in order to protect their current contracts. So I'm not sure if their new contracts have been signed, but I do know that the contracts that had been signed before have not been dissolved. And so they've kept honoring those. And I think that is something very critical that needs to be dealt with and looked at, by the civilian governments that will, inshallah, sort of overthrow this current military regime. I think it's a very critical point.
Great. To piggyback on that question, do you think that the approach that Hamdok's government was taking with just opening the country to the World Bank and IMF and the Paris Club, and also for foreign investors of a different kind. Would that do you think under that kind of economic policy, would the marginalization of labor or the marginalization of even Sudanese landowners continue, do you think, or is it going to be on better terms than the current Gulf state?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I should say that I feel, as an anthropologist, I feel like my job is generally to ask those questions and then to have those that I sort of interact with give the answers. But I will try my best to I mean, I have generally been quite disappointed or critical of the kind of neoliberal reforms and sort of opening up of the Sudanese sort of, especially the agricultural sector, to foreign investors that occurred during this transitional period that was sort of spearheaded by Hamdok. I mean, I think, yes, there is a need for the agricultural sector to become more efficient, but farmers will tell you, smallholder farmers will tell you that part of what happened in the early 2000s is that the state withdrew all of its agricultural extension services, particularly in the Gezira, from farmers that as a result made their lives a lot more difficult, right? They didn't have the kind of support they needed to produce the way that they had in the past, and as a result went into debt and then were kind of forced to, in some cases, sell their land. And I mean, there was a struggle against that, and was partly successful. But my point being that I think opening up Sudan to foreign investment is not the right way to go, especially if we do not address the kind of larger legal framework that mostly protects the interests of investors currently and not of people being dispossessed. So I think there are models. I mean, Tanzania is perhaps one of them, where investment can happen if the law is strong enough to protect local people's interests. But again, I think part of what I was trying to sort of do with this talk is to argue that there are alternatives to kind of this large scale private kind of investments, and that there can be cooperatives and sort of collectives formed where people pool their resources in order to become more efficient as farms, and where we really keep the agricultural sector active, right? I mean, because if that is still the backbone of our economy, if most people are still on some level either employed by or living off the agricultural sector, at least partially, then we have to think about this very seriously. How do we not dispossess people, and how do we make sure that they do not lose their livelihoods in the process of kind of turning Sudan's agricultural sector into this kind of free-for-all for private investors.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Nasrin. I have a question from Samah Salman. Actually, three questions together. One is intense labor, low wage significantly associated with work done by women? That's number one. Number two, prior to 1970, how was land registered, and how the British modeled land ownership? And then question number three, the minute percentage utilization of Arab nation acquired land is twofold: long-term, and B, goodwill and money for funneling for other benefits, such as soldiers, for army and aid. So if you can address these questions.
Sure. Yeah, so let me start with the question around, I think it was kind of women. Yes. So we've seen a kind of, you know, and this has been going on for a long time, but a feminization of agriculture over quite a long period of time. And we've seen now most of the farms that I worked on, the harvesting labor was done by women, all of it exclusively. There were men who were kind of overseeing the kind of packaging and transporting of the produce. Young men who would, you know, the picture I showed, spraying the pesticides, etc. But again, like let's say on one farm you'd have maybe 20 women, you'd have maybe 2 men. Men generally in agriculture are working to clear the irrigation canals and to sort of deal with water generally, and they are a little bit more involved in planting. But what I've seen where I work is that the majority of men have exited farming and gone into kamain, so brick making, along the river, you know, and that's itself a sort of environmental issue because of what it might do to the kind of terrain along the Nile. But basically, you know, what people have said is that agriculture is no longer, for smallholder farmers, et cetera, is no longer viable, that brick making, there's a lot more money in it. And so we've seen not only the kind of feminization of agricultural labor, but also the absorption of women who formerly were not in farming. So pastoralist women who have lost access to grazing land, for example, are now entering farming and harvesting in particular. And I think that's, yes, exactly. That's precisely one of the reasons you see also a devaluation of that kind of labor, right? So, I mean, I'm trying to remember, and you know, things have shifted now in terms of the currency, but I think I want to say people were making per day. So people were, it was like a day labor. Were making something like $2 maybe at the time. I mean, it was not enough to live for sure. And part of what was happening on medium-sized farms is that you would work from about, you know, like, yeah, basically sort of right before the sun rises to the afternoon, you'd get a little bit of money and then some produce, right? So you'd get to take a bag home of like bamia or aswad and barter that. Now on the more commercial farms like Sama Dawood's, et cetera, you're not allowed to take anything. Even like some of them will have some animals at home and will want to take some, but they'll actually get arrested for taking sort of alfalfa or anything else for animal feed. So, I mean, there's some major labor issues that need to be addressed, and people are, I mean, they're organizing in part. Even the Gezira Farmers Alliance does have women in it. I think there's a need for more kind of organizing and support of landless workers' rights. The Kanabi Association is sort of one of these bodies, but women tend to be not as well represented in those kind of more formal organizing bodies. And so I've seen some, like there was one of the farms I worked on, there was actually a strike organized by the women that led to higher wages and more protective gear. You know, the farm owners kind of present anyway, so I don't want to go on and on, but the idea is that I think there is a need for support of kind of organizing to protect especially women's landless women's workers' rights. In terms of land registration, so this is one of the legacies that the British left us. The only land that is sort of formally registered, from what I understand, in Sudan is actually on the Gezira scheme. The land elsewhere is registered in other ways, but it isn't formally recognized by the government as registered. So even before 1970, you still saw the kind of same trends. It's just that the Unregistered Land Act in 1970 kind of re-enshrined that into law. And as I said, verbatim used sort of the British laws that were used to dispossess people of their land, to bring communal lands under state control. You know, it sort of reinforced the ability of the state to seize those lands. So I think there is, I mean, this is one of the things that I looked at in the Undom case, the formalization of land rights and the sort of parceling out of land titles is not necessarily an answer if the criteria that determine whether or not you can have, you can obtain access to land and a title are exclusive, right? If they exclude certain people based on either residents in the area, so that necessarily excludes pastoralists, for example, etc. So there's a need to think about land titling not in different ways, I would say, than they are currently. What is the other question? Sorry, there's another one.
The third question is the minute percentage of utilization of Arab nation land.
Yes.
Is twofold. Okay. A, long-term, and B, goodwill, and of course money funneling for other benefits.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think we saw kind of, during the Bashir regime, we also saw the kind of Islamization of the banking sector, and that kind of enabled a lot more Gulf money to be funneled into projects, right? And so some of these projects are land agricultural projects that end up not doing a whole lot. I mean, this Zaid al Khair farm, I think it was acquired, I want to say in the early 2000s, but it didn't actually become operational until about 7 years later. And it was clear that the owner, his name is Al-Mansouri, was basically, so there's a kind of twofold, several things happening here. He was basically getting money from the Emirati government, essentially, the UAE sort of government entities, under the sort of auspices of funneling it into this agricultural project, but not doing a whole lot, banking on the fact that his donors would probably never come to Sudan and check out the farm. So there was some sort of suspicions of also sort of embezzlement, using these projects for their own kind of embezzlement of funds, etc. But also, there's of course ways in which these projects then can funnel money into the pockets of government, Sudanese government elites, who can then, provide favors, political, economic favors to Gulf and also other. I mean, I should mention, for example, at some point I was looking into what was happening in Sawakin with the Qataris and the Turkish government as well, where they were essentially trying to establish seize land, along the Red Sea for strategic reasons, military and otherwise. And so I think land becomes a way of funneling money into the right hands for these kinds of geopolitical purposes, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In answering your second question about registration and the formalization, that the formalization of registration does not really help the indigenous population and workers. Is there are the initiatives that are coming from these people? Are they heard by any government entities or any larger organization? How can they be supported?
I mean, that is an excellent question. And that is something that I, as a researcher, I don't have the kinds of connections I would like to have to be able to do some of that connecting. I don't think they are heard enough. I mean, the Gezira Farmers Alliance is perhaps a little bit more well-connected, and they're, I think, able to, certainly I know that they've had, conversations as kind of part of the Forces for Freedom and Change with members of the transitional government. Where that's gone, I'm not sure. In terms of the Kanabi Association and some of these smaller kind of organizing that is happening with landless workers, I think, I mean, this is an interesting thing that I did not mention as part of my research. There are actually some Sufi sheikhs that have done sort of mediated land disputes, etc., that are trying to, and one of them was Azraq Taiba, who unfortunately passed away, but he was actually quite instrumental in trying to at least raise the profile of some of the grievances and issues that landless workers and also dispossessed smallholder farmers were raising. And so I think we'll need more of those kinds of figures, people who are kind of liaisons between government elites and others. Now, there are local government people who are often, so this is another thing, like they're government elites who have struck these deals with elites, with say Saudi, Emirati agribusiness investors, and then you have the more local state level government officials who are hearing the grievances from dispossessed farmers and even some of the workers and trying to relate those to the kind of higher ups in Khartoum who get ignored. And when they sort of challenge some of the decisions made that are top down, sometimes they get fired or dismissed. And so that's obviously also a big problem. We can't sort of look at government officials as all the same. I think especially the kind of smaller ones that sometimes farm themselves or have family that are in the farming sector could be allies, certainly in relaying some of this information. But again, I mean, this is obviously within the context of the military regime. They're going to just look out for their own interests. But in the future, I'm hoping that, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to do or say through my research, is that it's absolutely necessary to bring pastoralists and smallholder farmers and harvesters to the table when shaping land policies. I mean, in thinking about land reform, if we don't include them, their voices, their perspectives, their lived experience in shaping these policies, we're not going to, that's not going to get us closer to land justice. We're going to replicate the kind of inequalities in land that we've seen, now for generations.
Great, thank you. It looks like more questions are coming in the pipeline. So I will speed up and summarize them. The next question is how to protect the communities that are being exposed to all of these toxic practices of the gold miners, and whether there are any international organizations that people can mobilize to help these communities.
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. I think that needs to, again, be codified in the law, right? Where whoever sort of invests, gets a mining concession, is held accountable to a law that says that they cannot use these toxins. And if they do, then at least the local community can sort of go to court, take them to court, etc. Until that happens, right, I think there's, and I think international bodies can certainly help. But again, I think this is one of the lessons that I'm taking from some of the young people who are at the forefront of the revolution, is that we really have to focus on strengthening the local capacity of people to hold, elites in power and other kinds of, economic and political elites accountable. And if we don't establish the kind of legal framework and other kinds of mechanisms to do so, and rely on international organizations who, sometimes have their own interests, right? I think, we're going to be doing them a disservice, basically.
Great. That the next question is, in your opinion, and based on the on other successes in other countries, how would the solution to such a complex and large scale problem be prioritized? For example, addressing inequitable foreign investment policies, practices first, and then large scale private investment, or it has to be a comprehensive reform? Should it be like step by step, or a comprehensive reform?
Yeah, that's another great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I mean, I think the first step for me is to really bring the stakeholders to the sort of decision-making table and shaping some of these policies. I mean, the transitional period before the coup presented an opportunity to do so. And I think that in some ways it was missed. And I think I'm hopeful that in the future, that won't be missed. There are enough organizing bodies. And you know, when we talk about even landless workers, right? I mean, I was sort of naively, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but surprised by how many people I harvested with who have degrees in agriculture, you know, who know not only through their labor, but also through their education, exactly what needs to happen to make the agricultural sector more just, more equitable, and more efficient. And so the solutions lie with the people who are closest to the issue, right? Who are working on the land. We need to basically, I think, you know, sort of train people, researchers, to collect that data and to figure out how to kind of bring their voices to the decision-making table and to shape policy in that way. I do think there needs to be a comprehensive land reform. One that has not happened since really our independence. And so for that to happen, I mean, there's something called the Via Campesina, which is a kind of large movement of social movements, of landless movements around the world that has actually expressed interest in connecting to groups in Sudan. And there's some of that starting to happen. Language is a barrier, but I think that, you know, we have clearly enough expertise in Sudan to overcome that barrier. But I think that is another solution, is to kind of find a way to connect some of the organizing, the groups that are starting to form with social movements, indigenous, for example, landless movements in Latin America that have had a lot of experience in sort of, constitutional reforms and sort of land reform policies, right? To each other, because there are lessons that can be learned, I think, from each other. So I would love, for example, to bring some of the people that I worked with to some of these Via Campesina forums, right? If, you know, visa policies, et cetera, allow, and to have, you know, myself or others be there to kind of translate and support them. It's something that I used to, before doing this work, I actually worked in Latin America with the landless movement of Brazil. And I've always had that kind of vision to kind of have this sort of South-South conversation and dialogue around what a comprehensive land reform could look like, because ultimately we're kind of fighting the same forces, like the same neoliberal kind of, you know, some of the same agribusiness companies that are grabbing land in Sudan are also grabbing land in Mali and other places across the world, right?
Mm-hmm. I should probably read the question of the audience then keep asking my questions. This is a question from Ether Sprague. The map of land grabs included the U.S. in Western Darfur. What resources are being accessed by the U.S. in Western Darfur? Do you have any idea?
No, I don't know that much. I mean, I think that the person probably to talk to about this is Suleiman, I think, Baldo? Yes. I think he's done some research on this. I mean, what I do know is that some of the lands, in 2009, I went to Darfur in part to sort of look at this, but there were some lands that people were forcibly displaced from that were then seized by the state, and those mining concessions were given. I believe there are South African, Malaysian, and French companies, gold mining mostly. But I don't know much about that, so I'm not going to pretend to. But I think there are people that are doing that research, and if not, there should be, because you know, the question of I think there's some really good Sudanese scholars working on sort of gold mining operations and the kind of impact it's had on local communities, etc.
Okay, great. A question from Tariq Hamada. Do you have data on how these land grabs are utilized for? Is it just agriculture projects, or maybe mining or something we are totally not aware of? Also, is there any data about employment in these mega agricultural projects, local versus other? So I see you have responded to some of these, a part of this question in terms of just employing technicians who could do all the work, foreign technicians, and then employing the locals as cheap labor for clearing the land. But do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, in the Gezira and in the region that I work in, the land is mostly being grabbed for agricultural projects. Again, I think there are other parts of Sudan where the land is grabbed for mining. Other things I'm not aware of. I mean, the data on this is very, very sparse, and I actually had a very difficult time accessing it, especially under the former regime. So, I mean, and even people who study, sort of the land rush in Africa say that Sudan has the least sort of transparent, there's just not very much data, which is partly why I do the research that I do. But I also feel like there needs to be a kind of more, there needs to be more data collection and research done on this in the entire country, especially in more marginalized areas of the country that are a little bit more difficult to access in terms of figuring some of this out. Again, in terms of labor, I mean, I do want to say, because I feel like I get criticized sometimes for being so critical of DAL, especially for those of you who might purchase their products. DAL has done a much better job, obviously, at employing local people on their farms, both technicians, they've trained technicians. So that also goes to show that these other farms could train Sudanese technicians, but also, the security guards, etc. I mean, they're mostly, and they've done a little bit of a better job also dialoguing with the community, establishing some health centers, schools. Again, not enough, I would say, but at least it's a start. And so I think that goes to show that if there were sort of guidelines in place that would actually hold investors accountable to sort of guidelines that say you need to do this, this, and this, compensate people, or get dialogue with them on the kinds of resources they want and need for you to then provide, then maybe, again, I'm not a fan of these big, I don't think this is the way forward, but in the interim, right, I think that is something that could be done. I know I'm not actually answering Dr. Hamada's question, but I think the data, I would say there is very little, and I'm gathering it as an anthropologist, but as anthropologists, we don't do this kind of large scale data gathering. So I think there needs to be, political scientists, sociologists, other kinds of scholars in different fields that do this kind of research,
Yes, great. Let me just ask you this question, even though it is kind of like in the economic realm. From your experience in dealing with these people, it looks like the collective and these cooperatives are really deeply rooted in the Sudanese culture, whether it is in the north, south, west, wherever. And it has never been recognized as a viable economic system by any government so far. Even Hamdouk's government, there was a consultant on cooperative who was hired by the finance ministers, and then he was fired, or I think he probably quit out of frustration. But do you see like this model, from Ahmed in Gezira and from Rauda and Fatma, all talk about the same model of cooperative. Do you think this is something that might gain some traction? Later on.
I mean, I hope so. I honestly think that's the only way forward, especially if we're thinking about kind of environmental sustainability and the climate crisis and desertification. I think that is the only way that we will actually be able to kind of sustain agriculture in the long run. And I'm kind of working on a new project at the moment that looks at Black migrants in Latin America. And so I've spent some time in recent months there. And as a sort of, and my partner who's from Burkina Faso, but he kind of was interested in cooperative farming in Central America. And we met with several indigenous and Black-owned coffee and cocoa farmers and sort of watched the way that they organize their farms. Very efficient. They're all organic farms. They struggle a little bit to find markets outside of their region. And that's something that they're now working with. There's a couple of organizations in the US. One of them is called Equal Exchange that are trying to open up, they've been trying to open up these markets for coffee and cocoa farmers for a while now. And I think that is a good model, figuring out how to, and this is something the diaspora could potentially get involved in as well. How do we not only encourage the formation of these cooperatives, but then also support them in accessing markets elsewhere, right? Where, they can package and sort of market and sell their products abroad as organic products. I mean, I think there are models of that, especially in Latin America, that could be looked at. And I think there are ways in which we in the diaspora could potentially support those kinds of initiatives. I mean, to me, women-led farming cooperatives are probably the way forward because, I mean, I've been very, very impressed with some of the women have actually, as I said, there's sort of a form of resistance, you could say, but they've used the edges of the farms to grow food, and they barter in different seeds and so forth. They dry the seeds from the harvest that they take home, and then basically grow subsistence, little sort of subsistence plots. And sometimes when they're found out, they get fired or worse. But I think that to me, it's like really thinking about their own knowledge of farming. How can that be harnessed in a collective way? And they have these sanadig where they already support themselves, right? They pool money for different things, whether it's, somebody gets sick. I remember I harvested for several months with people. I was not a very good harvester, but I also didn't take any money, so they were fine with it. But in any case, they would pool their money on a weekly basis. And if somebody was sick, let's say they got malaria or something, they would then give that person, they would pool more money and give that to the person, right? So there was a kind of mutual aid aspect to these sanadig. They would rotate the sandug, and people would say get furniture for their house, or maybe things for their children's schooling, or pay for somebody's health needs, etc., through this kind of sandug. And I think that can be thought of as a model for cooperation in farming as well. So there are lots of local ways in which people are already operating that could be maybe scaled up a little bit, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Let me just do my last question, because usually we finish at 12:30. So we heard, for example, in Bolivia, the indigenous people got together and said to the government that, actually mobilized the government to say, we are not going to extract oil from our mountains. But they wanted the international community and the rich countries specifically to pay for that, like to pay them for not getting the oil out of the land. Is there any effort by the indigenous people in the Sudan to also create demands like that? For example, in South Kordofan, the extraction of oil has been known to, as you mentioned, all these bad effects on the agriculture, on the animals, and so on. That people are saying it is better to keep the agriculture going and not to extract oil. But is there any models like that? Did you find any of that in your research?
I mean, not specifically related to oil because of the region that I work in.
Right.
But in terms of, I mean, I think there are demands around water because of the sort of underground aquifers and the Nile, right? In terms of use, right? I mentioned the Saudi farm that sort of basically depleted the underground kind of water source for the local communities through its aggressive farming practices. So from what I know, I mean, I've seen some articulation of specific demands around kind of farming practices that are meant to protect the environment that I'm sure there are, especially in South Kordofan and elsewhere, similar demands around kind of extractive industries, mining, et cetera, around the kinds of practices. I mean, I think I mentioned some before.
Right.
I think the question is, to what degree are people organized in a fashion that those demands can be heard by the right people? And how can, and I think there is some efforts to do this, but I, for example, right now, I'm inspired by the ways in which the neighborhood resistance committees in cities are being supported by the diaspora or amplified. You know, they have their spokespeople now, and there's no excuse for people to not include them in the conversation, especially people who are doing media interviews, et cetera. I think something similar needs to happen with attention to rural areas. There's enough organizing happening, some of which I'm not aware of because I'm very sort of localized as an anthropologist. Certainly the Farmers Alliance, the Kanabi Association that I mentioned, has spokespeople, and they come together and they've created platforms and demands that are very clear that need to be amplified. And part of what I'm hoping to do is to return to kind of collect some of that data and sort of write it up, if you will. But, you know, I encourage anybody who's here who has those kinds, I mean, really, if you go home and you're not from a major city, right? If you go home to your relatives, please ask about land grabs. They're sort of multiplying, certainly in the period before the revolution. And there are people always organizing against them, and there are ways that you can support.
So, excellent. Ms. Reen, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And the amount of knowledge that you conveyed on us, we really appreciate that. We have recorded the webinar, and all of you will get a link to the recording. We will also post a link on the ASAPA website. Thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon wherever you are. Or
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Nasreen. All the best.
Bye.